Mom, it's not taking your house. It's protecting it. Emily said it so gently, softly, like it was love speaking, not strategy. Margaret Hill stared at the papers on the dining table. Her house, the place where she raised her daughter, celebrated birthdays, mourned her husband, planted roses with her bare hands now reduced to a stack of legal documents and 4 signature lines. Her heart whispered, wait, something feels wrong. But Emily smiled again, placing her hand over her mother's. Mom, if anything ever happens to you, the bank could take the house. Scammers could target you. This makes everything safe for both of us. Safety, protection, family. Those were words Margaret trusted. She wanted to believe her daughter knew better than fear, better than doubt, better than that quiet voice inside her saying, don't sign. Emily pushed the pen toward her. Mom, please. We're doing this together. Margaret looked up. Emily wasn't a child anymore. She was confident, polished, decisive. A woman who survived the world and learned how to shape it. For a moment, Margaret felt small. She picked up the pen. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from something she couldn't name. Her signature slid across the line, one stroke, then the next, and the next, each curve of ink, disconnecting her from everything she worked for. Click! The pen cap snapped shut. Emily exhaled, not relief, not tenderness, but something else, satisfaction. Before Margaret could process the shift, Emily folded the documents neatly, slipped them into a folder, and stood. Perfect. I'll take care of the filing. You don't need to worry about anything anymore. Margaret forced a smile. All right if you say so. But as Emily walked away, her expression changed. The softness vanished, replaced by calculation. Cold. Controlled. Certain. Margaret caught only a glimpse of it, but it sliced through her chest like ice. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, tea going cold in her hands, Margaret replayed her daughter's words. It's not taking your house. It's protecting it. We're doing this together. But the silence inside her home felt different, heavier, unfamiliar, almost foreign. As if something invisible had shifted ownership already. She didn't know it yet, but today was the last day the house truly belonged to her. Because sometimes betrayal doesn't start with yelling. Sometimes it begins with a smile and a signature. The change didn't happen overnight. It happened in small, sharp pieces, the kind you only notice when they start cutting you. 3 days after the title transfer, Margaret walked into the living room to find a neatly typed paper taped to the fridge. Rules, not suggestions, not a conversation. Rules. No guests without notice. Kitchen use limited to mornings only. Living room must stay tidy at all times. Personal belongings should remain inside the assigned bedroom. Assigned. The word stung. She read it twice, then a third time, thinking maybe she misunderstood. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe it was organization. Emily walked in just then, holding a yoga mat and an iced matcha. Oh, you saw the list. Good. Her tone was casual, like she was reminding her mother to pick up apples from the store. Margaret swallowed. Yes, I saw it, but I've always kept things tidy. Emily laughed softly, a small, dismissive sound. Mom, it's not about mess. It's about structure. The house needs better boundaries now that it's under our management. Oh, not yours. Something shifted in Margaret's chest. That evening, Margaret tried to sit on the living room sofa to watch a show she always enjoyed. Barely 10 minutes passed before Emily's voice floated in from the hallway. Mom, I'm trying to work out here. Could you watch TV in your room instead? Her room, not the bedroom, not your space. Her room, like a boarding house. The next day, another change. The decorative pillows Margaret hand-stitched years ago were gone from the couch, replaced with expensive, neutral-coloured cushions Emily ordered online. Then the framed picture of Margaret and her late husband gone from the hallway wall, replaced by a minimalist canvas print that said, Live, Laugh. Love. Margaret stared at it for a long time. Love. Such a pretty word when spoken. Such a violent word when used as leverage. Later, when she opened the pantry to reach for her tea, she noticed her favourite box had been pushed to the very bottom shelf behind protein bars and prebiotic supplements she'd never eat. "Mom," Emily said behind her, not looking up from her phone, "please don't move things around anymore. Everything now has its system. System. House. Rules. Boundaries. Assigned space." Margaret nodded, but inside, something sank. She sat alone that night, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone lukewarm again, listening to the sound of her own house, her memories being reorganized into someone else's vision. In the silence, a truth crawled its way into her mind. She wasn't living in her home anymore. She was being allowed to stay in someone else's. A guest. No, a burden. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No argument. No warning. Just a sentence spoken casually while Emily scrolled through her phone. "Next month we need the guest room empty. My Pilates instructor may stay for a while." Margaret froze. The guest room? Her voice cracked on the word, because the room Emily was talking about wasn't a guest room. It was Margaret's sewing room. Her sanctuary. The place where she kept fabric from her honeymoon. The baby quilt she made for Emily. The half-finished blanket she once planned to give to her future grandchild. Emily didn't look up. Yes, it's wasted space right now. And she needs somewhere quiet while she's going through her breakup. Breakup. That was the reason her mother's memories needed to be boxed and erased, because a stranger was sad. Margaret stood there a moment, waiting foolishly for her daughter to add something softer. A thank you. A compromise. A tone that sounded like family. Nothing came. So Margaret nodded. "All right, I'll start packing." Emily smiled satisfied, not touched. "Great! And while you're at it, maybe get rid of some of that old stuff. We need a cleaner aesthetic." Old stuff. Cleaner aesthetic. Words sharp enough to cut. The next morning, Margaret entered the room. Sunlight spilled across shelves full of her life fabrics, photo albums, scrapbooks, letters, pieces of who she used to be. She picked up a small sweater, tiny, yellow, with uneven stitches. Emily's first winter sweater. She remembered staying up until 2 a.m. Mate, sewing, crying because she couldn't figure out the pattern, laughing because motherhood made her fierce, clumsy, and hopeful. Margaret folded it gently and placed it into a cardboard box, then another item, and another. One box turned into two into 5. While she worked, she heard Emily laughing downstairs on speakerphone. No, she won't mind. She barely uses the space anyway. Honestly, she needs less clutter, it'll be good for her. Margaret paused, sweater in hand, breath tight. Clutter. Not memories. Not history. Not love stitched into fabric. Clutter. Her hands trembled as she lifted the final framed photo, one of her, Emily, and her late husband holding a newborn baby. That was the moment it hit her. She wasn't packing belongings. She was packing existence. By sunset, the room stood empty, walls bare, shelves cleared, the smell of lavender and sewing thread replaced by the cold scent of nothing. Emily walked in, glanced around, nodded like a landlord inspecting work. Perfect. This feels much more functional. Margaret didn't respond. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the first wound no one sees. And this boxing up 35 years of her life was the first cut. It wasn't spoken. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't even hidden. It was waiting for her on the kitchen table. A single folded note beside her morning tea. Margaret assumed it was a grocery list. But when she opened it, her breath stopped. Please move out by Friday. 7 words. No apology. No explanation. No warmth. Just a deadline. The kind used for overdue rent. Or eviction notices. Her hands shook as she read it again, hoping somehow the meaning would change. It didn't. She looked around the kitchen, her kitchen where she once baked cookies for Emily's classmates, where she kissed her husband while stirring soup, where laughter existed before silence took its place. Now everything felt staged, sterile, like she was standing inside a house she accidentally walked into, not one she lived in for decades. Footsteps approached. Emily entered, dressed in a flawless suit, hair tight, posture sharp, someone ready for a meeting, not a conversation. "You got the note?" she asked, pouring herself coffee like she'd asked about weather. Margaret swallowed. "Yes, I saw." Emily didn't look up. "Good. We just need the space." The instructor confirmed she's moving in sooner than expected. "It'll be temporary." Temporary, like Margaret's existence. "Emily," she tried, her voice cracking. "Where am I supposed to go?" This time, Emily finally looked at her, not with cruelty, but with something worse, indifference. "Well, there are senior housing programs and temporary living options at the community centre. You'll figure it out." "You always do." Margaret stared at her daughter, the same child she held while she cried after her first heartbreak. The girl she stayed awake for through fevers, the young woman she worked double shifts to send through college, and now she was an inconvenience to be relocated. Something inside Margaret broke not loudly, but quietly, like a thread snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. She nodded. "All right," she whispered. "I'll leave." Emily smiled politely, as if the conversation were finished. "Thank you for being reasonable." Reasonable, as though leaving her own home was logic, not loss. That night, Margaret sat alone in the dim kitchen, staring at the note again. "Please move out by Friday." Her house had once held memories. Now it held instructions, orders, deadlines. She pressed the paper flat with trembling fingers and whispered to no one. "I never thought family could sound like eviction." And for the first time, she understood. This wasn't her home anymore. It was hers only until her daughter decided otherwise. And that day had come. It was still dark when Margaret woke. Rain tapped against the window steady, cold, almost respectful, as if the sky itself understood this wasn't just another morning. She dressed quietly, choosing a sweater she'd owned for years because it still smelled faintly of lavender and autumn. Then she brought out the suitcase. Not a large one, just enough to hold the things Emily hadn't already boxed, relocated, or labelled as non-essential. Margaret packed slowly, not because she needed time, but because every item she touched felt like a goodbye. Her favourite teacup, a rosary her husband once carried in his pocket, a photograph of her holding newborn Emily, both smiling. She placed that one last. By the time she zipped the suitcase shut, the house was still and silent. Not peaceful, just empty. As she walked toward the front door, she paused. The hallway walls, once filled with framed memories, now looked like a hotel corridor. Smooth, neutral, unclaimed. Where her wedding photo once hung, there was now a generic print of dried flowers in beige tones. Her life had been replaced by decor. At the doorway, she hesitated. Maybe, just maybe, Emily would wake up and say, "Mom, wait, I didn't mean it. Stay." But the only sound was rain and the low hum of the refrigerator. So Margaret placed a small note on the console table, polite, simple, undeserving. "I've left. Take care." She placed the house key beside it. Not because she wanted to, but because it no longer felt like hers. When she opened the front door, a cold gust of wind rushed in. And for a moment, Margaret wondered if the house itself was exhaling, relieved to be rid of her. She stepped outside, pulling her coat closer. The rain soaked the pavement and made the world feel blurry and unfamiliar. She reached the bottom of the steps before her body stopped, not her feet, but something deeper. She turned back one last time. The porch light flickered softly, the same warm glow that once welcomed birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and late-night conversations. Now it looked like a lighthouse she no longer had permission to return to. Her throat tightened, not with anger, but with a grief so vast it felt older than she was. She whispered into the rain, barely audible. "I'm leaving my home not because I want to, but because I no longer belong." Then with trembling fingers, she pulled the hood over her head, grabbed the suitcase handle, and walked, not from her daughter's house, but from her own. Because sometimes the most painful goodbyes aren't the ones spoken. They're the ones silently handed to you, on paper, with a deadline, and no love attached. And as she disappeared into the rain, one truth settled in her chest. Family didn't push her out. Control did. The room smelled like old paint and loneliness. Margaret stood in the doorway, suitcase still in her hand, staring at the space the shelter staff called temporary housing. A single metal-framed bed sat against the wall, its mattress thin and uneven. A small dresser leaned slightly to one side, one drawer stuck open. The fluorescent light above flickered, as if unsure whether to stay on or give up. There were no family photos, no curtains, no warmth, just walls and a silence thick enough to suffocate her. She slowly stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded too final. As she placed her suitcase on the bed, the springs groaned a loud, unpleasant metal shriek that echoed across the tiny room. She froze. In the hallway, someone laughed. Another voice coughed. Footsteps dragged across linoleum. She wasn't alone, yet she had never felt more isolated. Margaret sat on the bed, hands resting on her lap, staring at the bare wall in front of her. The white paint was chipped in places, showing layers underneath beige, blue, then beige again. People lived here before me, she realized. People with stories. People with losses. People who had nowhere else to go. She took a shaky breath. How did I get here?" she whispered. The question wasn't meant for anyone, but it demanded an answer. She thought of her home, the roses she planted, the quilt she sewed, the dinners she cooked with laughter in the air. Then she saw another memory, Emily's cold smile. The new rules taped to the fridge, the note that said, "Please move out." A tear slid down her cheek, quiet and slow. Not because she was crying, but because she could no longer hold the grief where it belonged. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small frame photo, her, Emily, and her late husband taken back, when smiles were genuine and family meant safety. She placed it gently on the dented nightstand. The room didn't change, but something inside her did. Pain sharpened into awareness. She wasn't here because life fell apart overnight. She was here because trust, the kind you build over decades, had been used as leverage. She wiped her cheek and breathed in. The air tasted unfamiliar. But survival has a scent too. Soft, quiet, persistent. Margaret lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling as the flickering light settled into a steady glow. She wasn't ready to fight. Not yet. But the part of her that still remembered who she used to be, strong, capable, loved, was waking up. And somewhere deep inside, a new thought formed. If they could take her house, they could not take her dignity. Not unless she let them. The envelope didn't look important. It was thin, wrinkled, and stamped forwarded mail. Margaret almost threw it away with the pile of grocery flyers and community notices. But something instinct maybe made her stop. She sat on the thin shelter bed, carefully tearing the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it, and the words hit like a punch to the chest. Notice of delinquency, mortgage payment, past due. Mortgage, past due. Her name wasn't on the property anymore, but the address printed at the top was unmistakable. Her home. Her voice shook as she whispered the line aloud. Your loan balance is now 90 days late and at risk of foreclosure. Foreclosure. The word felt unreal, like a foreign language she suddenly understood too well. She scanned the page again, searching for a mistake. But beneath the bold letters sat the truth she never knew existed. A second loan, a lien, a financial collapse already in progress. Her hands trembled. No one told her. No one asked her. Her house, the house she paid off after decades of double shifts, late nights, and skipped vacations, was now collateral. Collateral for what? She didn't want the answer, but she knew it anyway. Her son-in-law? The investments he bragged about at family dinners. The business deals Emily defended every time Margaret questioned them. The times he said, "Trust me, this will pay off bigger than you think." It wasn't success. It was debt. Debt so deep, he used her home to climb out and dragged her with him. Her chest tightened as she remembered Emily's voice. "It's not taking your house. It's protecting it." No, it wasn't protection. It was preparation. A setup. A quiet erasure disguised as care. Margaret felt anger build slow, sharp, finally awake. She wasn't just unwanted. She was used. She stared at the letter again, each sentence clearer, louder, impossible to ignore. Her daughter didn't evict her because she needed privacy. She evicted her because the house was sinking, and Margaret was never meant to see it drown. A bitter laugh escaped her, small at first, then shaking with disbelief. "All those years," she whispered, eyes burning. "All those years I believed love couldn't be weaponized." But it had been. Softly, safely, legally. She folded the letter slowly, pressing the crease until it was sharp and clean the way Emily liked things. But her voice when it came was not soft. It was steel. "I may have lost my home," she said, breath steadying, "but I haven't lost the truth. And truth once seen cannot be unseen." Days blurred together in the shelter. Morning announcements. Cheap instant coffee. Paper schedules taped to walls. Faces tired from surviving more than from living. Margaret moved through it quietly, politely, invisibly, like someone practicing how to take up less space. During the day, she sat in the common area, filling out forms she didn't fully understand, housing applications, financial statements, waitlist requests that said things like, "Estimated approval time 6 to 18 months. Months." She had spent 35 years building a home, and now she needed permission to have a room. At night, sleep never came. Instead, she lay on the thin mattress listening to the world outside, passing cars. Sirens, footsteps down the hallway, muffled crying from someone in another room. Sometimes she heard laughter, not joyful laughter, but the exhausted kind that comes from people who have learned to survive disappointment. She would stare at the ceiling until her stomach twisted from hunger. So she'd get up, boil water in the shared kitchen, and eat instant noodles from a styrofoam cup, the kind she hadn't touched since her 20s. The first night she cried over it, not because of the taste, but because it reminded her she no longer had a dining table, a stove, a home. But tonight she didn't cry. She just sat at the small metal desk in her room, watching steam rise from the noodles. The room smelled like cheap seasoning, fluorescent lighting, and the faint scent of someone else's past. She lifted the fork slowly, ate quietly, and stared at nothing. There were no tears now. Her grief had gone somewhere deeper, to a place beyond crying. A place where pain stopped asking for attention and simply existed. She looked down at her hands. Hands that once cooked homemade meals. Hands that held her newborn daughter. Hands that stitched quilts and birthday dresses and memories into fabric. Now they held a plastic fork. Margaret let out a breath, not a sob, not even a sigh, just air escaping from a place that hurt. She whispered, "I never thought love could go silent." The words hovered in the room, unanswered. She wiped her fingers on a napkin, placed the empty cup in a trash bag, and sat straight, hands folded. posture steady like someone preparing for bad news, even when it had already arrived. The truth pressed against her chest. She didn't cry because tears felt useless. Like everything she'd built, everything she trusted, everything she thought family meant. Somewhere inside her, something cracked quietly, like a fracture no one sees until it becomes impossible to ignore. And that fracture whispered a new, unfamiliar thought. This cannot be how my story ends. Not here. Not like this. Not with silence where love should have been. Hope didn't arrive with trumpets. It walked in quietly, carrying a worn leather briefcase and a stack of community brochures. Margaret first saw him at the local community centre, a place she visited to fill out forms she didn't know how to finish. His name tag read, Daniel Ortiz, Legal Aid Volunteer Attorney. He was in his late 40s, with tired eyes that suggested he had seen too many people pushed into silence. When their names were finally called and she sat across from him, Margaret expected nothing, just another form, another boundary, another wait list. Instead, he asked one question, "Tell me what happened." No one had asked her that before. Not what she signed, not where she lived, not what she lost, but what happened. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied, then cracked open. She told him everything. The signature, the new rules, the eviction note, the forwarded mail, the foreclosure notice, the silence. Daniel listened, really listened, without interrupting, without judgment, without hurrying her to the end. When she finished, she expected him to sigh and tell her nothing could be done. Instead, he leaned forward. "Mrs. Hill," he said slowly, carefully, as though choosing words that carried weight. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't a family disagreement." He slid the foreclosure notice across the desk with a gloved hand. "This is elder financial abuse." The words hit her harder than the eviction letter. Abuse. The room felt too still, too loud, too true. Her voice dropped into barely a whisper. "But she's my daughter." Daniel nodded, expression soft but firm. Abuse doesn't stop being abuse just because the person shares your blood. Margaret blinked, stunned. He continued, voice steady like someone who has said these words far too many times. "People think this kind of thing only happens in scams or from strangers. But most elder financial exploitation comes from family, children, spouses, people with access, trust, and paperwork." Margaret stared at her hands, hands that once trusted signatures, meals, love. Daniel placed a document in front of her, a formal complaint form, a legal starting point, a voice. "You don't have to decide today," he said gently, "but you need to know you are not powerless. And you are not alone." For the first time in weeks, something inside her moved, not grief, not anger, but something quieter. "Resolve." She exhaled, slow and trembling. "I thought crying would make me feel weak," she said. Daniel shook his head. "Silence is what keeps people weak. Not tears, not truth." He slid a pen toward her, the second most important pen in her life. "Whenever you're ready," he said, "we fight." Margaret didn't reach for the pen yet, but she didn't push it away either. For the first time since losing her home, she whispered, "Maybe I'm ready to stop breaking." Daniel nodded. "Good," he said, "because now your story changes." It didn't happen in one sitting. It happened in hours long, heavy hours at a metal table in the community centre legal room, with a buzzing fluorescent light overhead and a stack of files growing taller with every discovery. Daniel worked with precision. Margaret worked with memory. Together, they began gathering the fragments of her erasure. Old text messages, screenshots, voicemails, emails she didn't delete because something in her heart had whispered, "Save it." "People don't always show abuse with bruises," Daniel said quietly while sorting documents. "Sometimes they show it through words." Margaret swallowed. Words. Words she once ignored because they came from someone she loved. Emily's messages flashed before her one after another. "Mom, it'll be easier once the house is under our name. Legally, it just makes sense. Please stop questioning everything." But then there were messages from her son-in-law, messages she had never seen until now. Daniel tapped the screen with his pen. "Here." Margaret leaned closer. It was a group text thread she was never included in. Her chest tightened. The message was short. Blunt. Cold. "Once the house is under my name, she won't have any say." Margaret blinked slowly, not because she didn't understand the words, but because she understood them too well. Not love, not protection, not misunderstanding. Control. Weaponized through paperwork and trust. Her breath shook. Daniel didn't rush her. He simply said, "That line alone proves intent." Next, he opened a voicemail. First, Emily's voice sharp, impatient. "Mom, stop dragging this out. You're making things harder than they need to be." Then another voicemail, this time her son-in-law, slurring his words. "Look, she'll sign. She's old. She doesn't want conflict." Margaret felt something hot rise in her, not tears, not grief. Anger. A kind of anger that didn't scream, but stood. Daniel printed the messages, marked timestamps, highlighted key statements. Piece by piece, the pile in front of them changed shape. It was no longer a pile of memories. It was evidence. Evidence of deception. Evidence of coercion. Evidence of elder financial abuse. When Daniel finished, he slid the folder toward her. "This is enough to open a formal case," he said. Margaret stared at the folder. It felt heavier than it looked. Heavy with betrayal. Heavy with truth. Heavy with a fight she never expected to face in the final chapters of her life. Her voice came out low but steady. "So what happens now?" Daniel didn't smile, not because it wasn't good news, but because justice is never simple. "Now," he said, "we make them answer for what they did." Margaret lifted the folder. Her hands no longer trembled. For the first time since she walked out of her home in the rain, she felt something powerful return. Not happiness, not relief, but agency. She looked Daniel in the eyes. "They thought I wouldn't fight," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "And now they're about to learn." Margaret finished the sentence for him. "I still have a voice." The courtroom smelled like old wood and nerves. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded tightly, her breath steady but not calm. Across the room sat Emily, hair styled perfectly, makeup soft and natural, the kind meant to say, "I'm gentle. I'm the victim." And when the judge entered, Emily's posture changed, shoulders softened, chin lowered, eyes glistening with premeditated sorrow. The performance began. "Your Honor," Emily said, voice trembling, "I love my mother. I did everything to help her. She's just confused and angry because she doesn't understand the paperwork." A soft sniffle, a tissue dabbed beneath her eyes, a carefully timed quiver in her voice. She continued. "She wasn't forced. She signed willingly. We were only trying to protect her. We never meant for this to become so ugly." Several jurors exchanged glances, some sympathetic, some uncertain. Margaret felt a familiar ache, the same ache she felt when she first realized her daughter wasn't defending her, but defending control. Daniel didn't flinch. When Emily finished, he stood slowly, letting silence breathe before he spoke. "Your Honor," he began calmly, "the defense paints a picture of care. But care is not coercion disguised with kindness." He tapped the tablet on his desk. "And now the truth." The screen lit up behind him. A text message. Large. Clear. Inescapable. "Once the house is under my name, she won't have any say." The room froze. No one breathed. Emily's face went pale makeup, cracking under tension. Another screen switched on. A voicemail. Her son-in-law's drunken voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "She'll sign. She hates conflict. Old people always do. A murmur rippled through the room, shock, disgust, realization. Emily shifted in her seat, fingers tightening, eyes darting toward her attorney. For the first time, the performance slipped. Daniel walked closer to the judge. This was not protection. This was not love. Another file popped onto the screen, the foreclosure notice. This was exploitation, deliberate, strategic, and financially motivated. Emily finally broke her silence. That's taken out of context. But the judge raised a hand, stopping her like a parent stopping a child mid-tantrum. His voice was calm, firm, unmistakably final. "Ms. Read," he said, eyes fixed on her. "The context is clear." He looked down at the signed documents, then back at Margaret, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, not pity but respect for someone who endured quietly. Then he delivered the words Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. This transfer was obtained through undue influence. A pause, a breath, a verdict. The deed is hereby reversed. Ownership returns to Mrs. Hill, effective immediately. Emily's jaw dropped, rage rising where tears once pretended to belong. Margaret didn't look at her. She didn't need to. Because for the first time since signing that terrible paper, she wasn't the one losing something. She was reclaiming something. Her home, her autonomy, her voice. And as the judge's gavel struck wood, the past did not disappear, but the power shifted, back to where it belonged. The day she returned wasn't grand or dramatic. No music, no applause, no one waiting with flowers or apologies. Just a quiet driveway, a familiar sidewalk, and the sound of wind moving through the same trees she once planted as saplings. Margaret paused at the gate, not because she was unsure, but because she finally had the luxury of taking her time. The house looked the same, yet entirely different. Not because the structure changed, but because this time it wasn't something she was allowed to be in. It was something that belonged to her. She walked toward the front door, suitcase rolling over the concrete, not like the morning she left in the rain, but steady, intentional, grounded. And there, mounted beside the door, was a bronze plaque she hadn't seen before. Hill Est, 1988. Her name, her life, her legacy. Not erased, not borrowed, not signed away, restored. She reached out and traced the engraved letters with her fingers. For a moment, the world blurred not from sadness, but from a relief so deep it felt ancient. Daniel had offered to drive her that morning. She declined. This was a road she needed to walk alone. She unlocked the door. The key felt heavier than she remembered, as if it understood what it meant to return. The moment she stepped inside, the air shifted. The scent wasn't the same. Some furniture was gone. Some things were replaced. Evidence lingered of someone else's temporary ownership. But the bones of the home were still hers. She placed her bag down near the entryway and stood still, letting the silence settle. Silence used to hurt. Now it felt like room to breathe. She walked through the hallway, past the wall where family photos once hung. It was bare now, but not empty. It was a blank page. In the living room, sunlight poured through the window. Resting on the wooden floor where years of footsteps had passed, her daughter's first steps, birthday gatherings, quiet mornings. Margaret exhaled, slow and steady. She wasn't the same woman who left. That woman carried trust like an unguarded treasure. This woman carried wisdom and a boundary that would not be crossed again. She moved to the kitchen, set a kettle on the stove, and waited as the flame warmed the steel. It felt symbolic, small warmth becoming something bigger. As the whistle finally rose, she poured tea into her favorite ceramic cup, the one she packed the night she left. She sat at the table, hands wrapped around the cup, and let peace, not memory, fill the room. She whispered, almost to herself, "I am home." Not just in the building, but in her identity. Her story changed not because someone saved her, but because she chose not to disappear inside someone else's control. Outside, the wind rustled the trees again, not as a reminder of the past, but as a promise of everything that could still unfold. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret smiled. The room wasn't large, just a modest, multi-purpose space inside the community centre. Rows of metal folding chairs faced a simple podium. No stage, no spotlight, no grandeur. And yet, when Margaret stepped forward, the room felt full of breath, full of attention, full of stories waiting quietly behind guarded eyes. She wasn't nervous. Not anymore, because now she wasn't speaking as someone seeking help. She was someone who survived and understood the weight of silence. In the front row sat women and men who looked like reflections of her former self, polite, uncertain, apologizing even for existing. Some clutched folders. Some held copies of housing applications. Some just held their hands together tightly, as if they needed something, anything, to keep from disappearing. Margaret gently placed her notes on the podium, though she didn't need them. She began softly. Most people think abuse looks loud, violent, obvious. She paused, letting the silence settle. But sometimes it sounds like love. A few heads lifted. Sometimes, she continued, it comes wrapped in kindness, responsibility, or duty. Sometimes the person hurting you is someone you raised, loved, trusted, because they knew you'd never believe they could do harm. Someone in the back wiped their eyes. Margaret took a steady breath, not from pain, but from clarity. Trust is love, she said, voice warm but firm. But love without boundaries becomes permission for harm. A murmur rippled through the room, not confusion, but recognition. The kind that comes when something true finally has language. She continued, when you give everything, your home, your money, your decisions, to avoid conflict, you don't protect the relationship. She lifted her chin slightly. You erase yourself inside it. Several people nodded now, slowly, deeply, like they were unlearning years of apology. Margaret rested her hands on the podium. I thought silence was respect. I thought surrender meant peace. But silence protected the wrong people. And surrender gave away pieces of my life I can never repeat. She smiled not bitterly, but with wisdom carved from survival. But I am here, still standing, still mine. Then she gestured gently toward the group. And you can be too. There was no dramatic cue, no music. Just one moment, a single person began clapping, then another. Then the entire room rose, not in pity, not in sympathy, but in solidarity. The applause wasn't loud. It was steady, healing, seen. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound wash over her, not as validation, but as confirmation. She was no longer a victim. She was someone who turned pain into warning, silence into voice, and loss into purpose. When the applause softened, she stepped away from the podium. Not smaller, not fragile, but whole. A staff member approached her afterward. Mrs. Hill, she said softly, would you consider returning next month to speak again? Margaret didn't need time to think. She smiled, not the timid smile she once used to avoid conflict, but the smile of a woman who knew her worth. Yes, she said, I would. As she walked toward the door, sunlight streamed in through the windows. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just real. And sometimes, real is the greatest victory. Margaret placed her hand briefly on her heart. She wasn't reclaiming her home anymore. She was reclaiming herself. And that more than any verdict or document was the true beginning. Sometimes the hardest battles in life aren't fought with fists or anger, but with truth, courage, and the choice to no longer stay silent. Margaret's story wasn't about losing a home. It was about rediscovering the strength she forgot she had. A strength that grew every time she was told to be quiet, to sit down, to accept less. She learned something many of us learn too late. Love is beautiful, but love without boundaries is not love, it's permission. And healing doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like standing again, speaking again, believing again. If Margaret's journey stayed with you, if somewhere in her story you saw someone you know, or someone you used to be, then remember this. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. And it is never too late to take your life back. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling this story with us. And thank you for honoring those who've lived similar chapters in silence. If you'd like more stories like this, stories of real resilience, hard truths, and quiet victories, please take a moment to subscribe, click the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter we share together. Until then, take care of your story, take care of your heart, and never apologize for protecting yourself. This isn't the end. It's just where strength begins.